Hello everyone, and welcome back. When we talk about cold today, we usually mean the kind that slips under the door in winter or makes us shiver while we wait for the bus. The kind we solve by turning up the thermostat or making another cup of tea. But there was a time not very long ago when the cold was not an inconvenience, but a presence, a force. Something ancient, patient, and impossibly vast. Tonight, I want to begin with the people who knew that kind of cold better than almost anyone, the mountain men. These were the trappers and wanderers of the early North American frontier, men who spent months at a time in landscapes where the air itself could take your breath away. And they learned something about cold that our modern world has largely forgotten. Something simple, but profoundly humbling. The cold does not hate you, it just does not care if you live. To understand their world, we have to strip away everything familiar. Central heating, weather forecasts, insulated boots, fleece jackets, heated gloves. Imagine instead waking up to a sunrise that does not warm the air, surrounded by endless snow and silence. The landscape shining like polished bone. There are no roads, no towns nearby. No one can hear you call out, and the nearest help might be weeks away over frozen rivers and jagged ridges. Your shelter is a lean-to of branches and hide. Your fire, if it survives the night, is no bigger than your hand. And if you let that flame die, if you misjudge the wind, or the wood is too damp, or exhaustion makes you careless, then the cold steps in, quiet, efficient, absolute. The mountain men did not begin as legends. Most were ordinary people who simply did not fit in the world they were born into, farmers who failed at farming. Veterans who carried the ghosts of battles no one spoke about, drifters who wanted a life larger than fences, and small towns. They followed rivers, crossed plains, and disappeared into mountains that maps did not even bother naming yet. They hunted beavers for fur and sold the pelts for money, though money in this sense meant staying alive for another year. They carried rifles, knives, and whatever stubbornness life had not yet taken from them. And they learned quickly because the mountains were not patient teachers. You either adapted or you were replaced. The first lesson was simple. You cannot fight the cold. People today sometimes speak about beating bad weather, escaping winter, outsmarting the elements. The mountain men did not believe in that. Cold was not something you overpowered. It was something you prepared for with almost religious attention. If the fire was burning, you never let it shrink to embers. If you found dry wood, you carried more than you needed because you never truly knew what the night would bring. If the wind changed direction, you did not ignore it. You shifted your camp, adjusted layers, checked your traps, and rethought your route. The cold was not an opponent. It was a judge, and it judged every decision you made. This was not just physical survival. It was psychological. They had to understand the cold in ways that do not translate easily into words. The sound of snow underfoot told them the temperature better than any thermometer. A soft, squeaking crunch meant deep cold, the kind that could take fingers if you uncovered your hands too long. A brittle cracking sound meant something different, a cold that could still be endured with care. They could feel storms before they came, reading the sky, the scent of the air, the hush of animals hiding before the wind began to rise. The world was speaking constantly. They survived by learning how to listen. We live now in a time where silence is rare. There is always noise, engines, voices, screens, alerts. But the mountain men lived inside a different kind of quiet, not a peaceful silence, but a vast one. A silence that made you realize how small you truly were. At night, the stars were sharp enough to make your eyes water, and the only sound was your own breath. If you shouted, your voice disappeared into open air with no echo to return it. Some men found this silence inspiring. Others found it terrifying. Many learned to respect it, because silence in the mountains is never just silent, it is the world watching you. Their relationship with the cold was not heroic. It was pragmatic. Romantic images of rugged men conquering the frontier are just that. Images. The real story is about endurance, patience, and a kind of humility that modern life rarely requires. The mountain men did not endure the cold because they were fearless. They endured it because they accepted reality as it was. The cold did not negotiate, so they stopped trying to bargain with their discomfort. They learned to sit with it, to move within it, to let it shape the rhythm of their day. Instead of seeing winter as an obstacle, they treated it as the environment they lived in. Just as fish do not question water, they stopped questioning cold. And the cold shaped them. Their hands became calloused in ways that were almost unrecognizable. Their skin hardened and cracked. Their breath turned to frost on their beards. Frostbite was not a rare emergency. It was an everyday inconvenience, something to work around. If you lost sensation in your fingertips, you did what you needed to do with your other hand. If your toes went numb, you stomped the ground and kept going. Pain was not a message to stop. Pain was proof that your body was still alive enough to respond. The real danger was numbness. Numbness meant you were losing the quiet battle. The cold was always fighting against you. Modern life teaches us to avoid discomfort, to seek warmth instantly, convenience automatically. But the mountain men lived in a world where comfort was earned, not assumed. A warm fire was a victory. A pair of dry socks was a blessing. A bowl of stew eaten slowly beside a flickering flame could turn into a kind of gratitude so deep it bordered on reverence. They did not need luxury. They needed warmth, food, and a place to sit without the wind tearing at them. And in those moments of warmth, however brief, they felt something modern people often search for but cannot name: presence, awareness. The sharp clarity of being alive in a world that does not guarantee you will remain so. We often think strength comes from force, muscle, boldness, ambition. But the mountain men lived a different truth. Strength came from stillness, from patience, from the willingness to keep going when the world offered you no encouragement. The cold did not care if you were tired. It did not care if you were homesick. It did not care if you felt alone. And so these men learned to carry their loneliness like another layer of clothing. Not comfortable, but necessary. If there is one thing the mountain men understood that we have forgotten, it is this: the world is not obligated to make you comfortable, and the cold does not negotiate. We have built lives filled with warmth, insulation, and ease. But sometimes, in moments of stillness, we feel a strange hunger for something harder, something real, something that does not bend to our wishes. The mountain men lived in that reality every day, and while their lives were harsh, they were also honest. The cold did not love them. The cold did not hate them. The cold simply waited to see whether they understood how to endure. And that understanding, quiet, humble, relentless, is the lesson they left behind. If the cold was the first teacher of the mountain men, then silence was the second. But this silence was not the gentle kind we might imagine from a quiet winter morning. This was the white silence, a vast, unbroken stillness that stretched across valleys, forests, frozen rivers, and mountain ridges, a silence so deep that it did not soothe the mind, it confronted it. And to live in that silence, the mountain men had to learn how to listen. The mountains never spoke in human language, but they spoke constantly. The trick was understanding what they were saying. To someone from a city or settlement, snow might seem simple, cold, white, and soft. But to a trapper, snow had vocabulary. It had tones, textures, behaviors. The sound of snow beneath boots was as meaningful as reading a map. If it squeaked high and tight, that meant the air was brutally cold, cold enough to stiffen leather and numb fingers in minutes. If it crunched softly, there was still a margin of safety. If it did not make a sound at all, that meant fresh powder laying over a hidden crust. Beautiful, but dangerous. It could conceal thin ice, unstable drifts, or deep pockets ready to swallow a leg and twist an ankle. A single misstep could mean a journey home shortened by days, or a night spent outside when the temperature dipped to a place where even fire struggled to stay alive. Every sound mattered. But in the white silence, silence was a sound of its own. When the world goes quiet in the mountains, completely quiet, it is never accidental. The wind pauses. The trees still. Even birds go silent. The trapper would stop mid-step, breath held, listening, because silence meant something was coming. Maybe a storm, maybe an animal, maybe simply a shift in the land itself. But the silence was never empty. It was a warning. This attentiveness did not come from instinct, not at first. It came from being humble, again and again, until the mountains, in their own indifferent way, started to teach A trapper might begin his first winter cursing the snow and shouting at the wind, believing volume might change circumstances. But the mountains do not bend to ego. Gradually, frustration gives way to quiet, complaints fade into observation. The world becomes a teacher one can finally hear. Animals were guides, too, not in some mystical sense, but practical. Crows flying low meant snow was coming. Elk moving down from ridges meant the cold was about to deepen. Wolves falling silent meant something larger had moved into their territory. Even small creatures, mice, squirrels, foxes, left trails in snow that told stories. Where they fed, where they sheltered, where they fled, to survive. A man had to see those stories, not just look at them. Modern life teaches us to see quickly, to process information fast, and move on. But in the mountains, attention was not speed. Attention was stillness. It was looking at the same patch of snow for a minute longer than comfort allowed. It was kneeling to touch the ground and feel the temperature beneath the surface. It was stepping lightly enough that the snow told him how deep it was, rather than forcing him to discover it with a fall. Where others saw wilderness, the mountain men saw patterns. We often imagine them as rugged, fearless figures who muscled their way through winter storms. In reality, their survival depended far less on strength than awareness. They noticed everything: the shift of clouds toward the horizon, the smell of moisture in the air, the way frost formed on their rifle barrel, the rhythm of their own breath. A careless breath could freeze against fabric. A careless moment could lose heat through a glove. A careless hour could cost a toe. There was no such thing as autopilot, because the mountains were constantly evaluating them even when they were not paying attention. Modern tools make weather feel predictable. We have maps, alerts, percentages, and forecasts. A storm is something we can schedule around. But in the 1800s, the only forecast was the land itself. Every decision had to be made based on what the senses perceived, look, listen, breathe, adjust. The men who survived longest were not the strongest. They were the ones who paid attention. They did not call it intuition. That word came later. They called it paying attention. The most honest name for knowledge earned the hard way. There is a subtle beauty in this kind of listening. Not beautiful in a romantic way, but in a truthful way. The white silence stripped away distraction. It forced the mind to slow down. It required a person to become small enough to fit into the landscape rather than trying to tower over it. And in that humility, understanding grew. The mountain man learned to walk without breaking the crust of snow, learned to hear the air pressure shift before wind arrived, learned to tell time by the length of his shadow and the tint of the sky, learned that storms do not shout before they appear, they whisper. And perhaps the most important lesson, you do not survive by conquering nature. You survive by aligning yourself with it. Today, we live in a world full of noise. The white silence is almost gone, covered by engines, notifications, and ceaseless conversation. But the lesson the mountain men left behind is not gone. It says this: if you stop talking long enough, if you stop defending your comfort long enough, if you stop trying to overpower the world for just one moment, you might finally hear what the world has been saying all along. When we imagine fire today, we picture something familiar and immediate. A stove dial that clicks, a lighter spark, a switch that turns red coils bright. Fire has become convenience, instant, obedient, predictable. But for the mountain men, fire was none of those things. It was a negotiation, a fragile truce with the cold, a flicker of light that separated survival from silence. If cold was the judge, then fire was the only argument a man had, and even then, the result was never guaranteed. The mountain men treated fire as currency. Every ember was worth more than gold. Heat was not comfort, it was life measured in hours. If the fire burned, you lived. If it faltered, you had to fight for warmth again, and so the act of building a fire became something closer to ritual than routine. Imagine a freezing evening in the mountain. The wind is moving along the ridges like a low, distant roar. Snow is falling in slow, heavy flakes that seem to swallow sound. Your hands are stiff inside your gloves, and every breath turns to frost. There are no matches, no lighter fluid, no warranted dryness. Just you, your tools, and whatever the mountain allows you to use. The mountain men carried flint and steel the way modern people carry house keys, not as an accessory, but as a requirement for existence. Losing that small bundle of metal could be the same as losing time. And time, in the mountains, was heat. Heat was the difference between sleep and silence. To start a fire, you needed tinder, not just any tinder, but something dry enough to catch. And in a world made almost entirely of snow and ice, dryness was scarce. So they carried scraps of cloth, tufts of moss, bark stored against their chest to keep it from freezing. The preparation never ended. Even while walking, they were scanning for wood, dead wood on the inside, not frozen on the outside. Bark that peeled clean. Branches that snapped with a sharp sound instead of a dull bend. Everything was assessment. Everything was calculation. Because when you are cold, you do not build a fire for light. You build it to keep your heartbeat steady. Once the tinder caught flame, the real work began. Fire could smother itself if fed too soon or too hungrily. It needed patience. Hands had to move slowly, adding twigs, then sticks, then wood, each step deliberate. The mountain men learned fire's personality. They could tell by the smell of smoke whether the wood was wet. They could tell by the pitch of the crackle how quickly it would burn. They could feel the heat not just on their skin, but in their bones. Fire was not a tool. It was a companion. In the wilderness, where silence stretched for miles, the fire was the only voice that answered. Its crackling was conversation. Its glow was presence. A small fire could push back a universe of darkness. It could turn a night of teeth and wind into something survivable. And yet, fire was not sentimental. It required constant attention. Turn your back too long, and the wind might take it. Fall asleep too deeply, and the coals might cool. Carelessness was not forgiven. The fire was alive, but only so long as you fed it. There is something deeply human in this relationship. We have always been shaped by fire. Long before cities, before farming, before books or monuments, there was a circle of light surrounded by night. Fire was where we learned to gather, to speak, to share warmth. And in the mountains, that ancient memory returned in full. The mountain men did not just use fire, they depended on it, the way a child depends on its first breath. By firelight, a man could rest, he could thaw his hands. He could cook something that did not break his teeth. He could exist without cold gnawing at his bones. And in those fragile moments of warmth, thoughts became softer. The endless awareness and tension of daylight loosened. Words, usually economical during travel, began to return. Some nights there were stories broken, half-remembered tales from places left behind. Other nights there was silence, the fire carrying all the sound necessary. A campfire changed the meaning of the night. Without it, darkness was something with edges and weight. The wind felt sharp. The stars seemed far and uncaring. But with fire, the darkness moved back, held at a distance. A circle of glowing earth became a declaration. I am here. I am alive. And I am not finished. But fire was also temporary. The mountain men knew better than to trust it. Warmth was always fleeting. When the last log burned down, the cold crept back in. And the cold always waited. That was its nature. So the men developed a habit of watching the fire the way one watches the horizon, measuring how much wood remained, how much time the flame would last, how long before they needed to gather more. This awareness created a different kind of thinking. Modern life encourages us to believe warmth, food, and comfort are permanent states. We expect them. We feel uneasy without them. The mountain men lived with the opposite understanding. Nothing is guaranteed. Warmth must be earned over and over again. This mindset changed everything. Life was not measured in days. It was measured in fires. In how many flames a man could coax from frozen wood. In how many mornings the embers could be revived into new flame. In how many nights he could sit between wind and frost, wrapped in furs, watching sparks rise into the dark. The fire also revealed character. Some men fussed over the flame, poking it constantly, unable to relax unless it burned perfect. Others sat still, trusting it to do what fire does if left alone. The anxious learned patience. The reckless learned respect. The cold taught lessons. The fire repeated them. Even eating was shaped by fire. Food cooked on coals tasted of smoke and effort. Coffee froze before it finished pouring, so men learned to drink it quickly or chew it. Meat roasted on sticks, dried into jerky over low flame, simmered in tin pots. Nothing gourmet. Everything earned. Yet those meals, eaten with numb fingers and quiet breaths, carried a satisfaction few modern dinners can match. When food is survival, not entertainment, gratitude comes naturally. And there is something else. The fire gave the mountain men their only true shelter. Not in a house, not in walls, but in warmth itself. Warmth was the boundary between life and winter. And so they guarded it with the same commitment we guard our identities, our relationships, our place in the world. The mountain men understood something essential. Fire is not just heat. Fire is present. Fire is persistent. Fire is the proof that one can endure. In the mountains, surrounded by snow and silence, the fire did not just keep a man warm. It reminded him that he still belonged to the world of the living. If fire was the mountain man's lifeline, then clothing was his first defense. Not a matter of style, identity, or appearance, but survival in its plainest form. We live in a world where clothing is chosen for comfort, shape, and expression. But in the mountains, clothing had a simpler requirement: keep the cold out long enough to see another sunrise. Every layer mattered. Every stitch had meaning. Every tear had a story. The mountain men dressed not to look rugged, but to stay alive. Their clothing was a shield, rough, heavy, stiff with smoke and grease, and utterly practical. Nothing was clean. Nothing was soft. Nothing was comfortable in the way we use that word today. Comfort was not a goal. Comfort was a luxury that belonged to a different kind of life entirely. You began with wool. Wool was the difference between life and frost. It could stay warm even when damp, and dampness was inevitable. The cold ensured that no garment ever stayed completely dry. Moisture clung to everything: breath, snow, melting, frost, the touch of your own skin. A wool shirt was rarely pleasant to wear. It itched. It chafed. It smelled of sweat and smoke. But it held heat, and heat was everything. Over the wool came the vest. That layer was about trapping warmth close to the chest, shielding the core. Then a coat often made of leather, sometimes patched together from pieces of hide or whatever, could be traded or salvaged. The coat was heavy enough that many men felt they carried their house on their shoulders, but the weight was reassuring. Every ounce was a reminder that the cold would have to work harder to touch them. And then came the final layer: fur. The fur coat, the fur hood, the fur mittens, each one a small piece of the wilderness repurposed for survival. The fur did not make them look heroic. It made them look oversized, misshapen, half-animal. But out there, looking human was not the goal. Staying human was. Their boots were rarely dry. Snow seeped in, melted by body heat, soaked the leather, then froze again. A constant cycle. Mountain men stuffed grass, moss, or spare hide into their boots to soak up moisture. Not elegant, just necessary. The sound of a trapper walking through snow was sometimes a soft crunch, sometimes a heavy drag, each step tugging against frozen leather and stiff seams. And the smell, well, that was its own chapter. Clothing became a memory of everywhere a man had traveled. Smoke, sweat, animal grease used for weatherproofing. And months of winter without washing, you could smell a trapper before you saw him. Wolves sometimes avoided them simply because the scent was so unfamiliar and unsettling. Their clothes did not just tell the story of survival, they announced it. But the layers were not only physical armor, they were mental armor as well. When you carry weight on your shoulders, constant, grounding, undeniable, you feel anchored in your own existence. In a world where silence can stretch so endlessly that it begins to erase your sense of being, the layers were a reminder. You are still here. They created a barrier, not just against cold, but against isolation. If you take a person and place them alone in the wilderness with nothing but thin clothes and open sky, the world can feel too big. The vastness pushes in. The silence expands. The cold touches the skin directly and seems to whisper something ancient. You do not belong here. Layers softened that voice. The fur against the back of your neck. The heavy coat pressing down your shoulders. The coarse wool against your chest. These sensations gave form to existence. They reminded the wearer that they were contained, defined, alive. In the same way, fire creates a circle of warmth against the darkness. Clothing created a boundary around the self, a fortress, small but meaningful. There was no removing layers for comfort. Removing clothing was a calculation. How cold is the air? How long will the task take? Can you do this without losing heat? You cannot regain. Even simple actions, cutting wood, setting traps, cleaning a rifle, became negotiations between warmth and mobility. Too many layers, and your fingers could not grip. Too few, and your fingers would stop working at all. They did not complain. There was no one to complain to. A tear in a coat meant a story, usually one involving a fall, a fight, or a fire that flared too high. A patch on a knee meant miles traveled. A burned sleeve meant a night spent too close to the fire when the cold pressed too hard. Clothing recorded a man's life the way journals do today. By spring, when the world softened and the snow began to melt, the mountain men were changed. When they removed their layers, they looked pale, lean, almost ghost-like skin, unused to the sun. Muscles carved not by exercise, but by necessity. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was a resilience that could not be taught. A quiet understanding shaped by months of carrying your survival on your body. And when autumn came, when the air sharpened and frost traced leaves at dawn, they put the layers back on without hesitation. Because the cold was not temporary in their world. It was a cycle, a returning truth. And the layers were part of that truth. Modern life gives us clothes that are light, clean, breathable, designed for ease. But the mountain men wore garments that reminded them of every step they had ever taken in winter. Their coats were weight, their shirts were memory, their boots were endurance. They did not dress to look strong. They dressed to remain alive. And in doing so, they discovered something simple and enduring. Warmth is not something the world gives you. Warmth is something you carry. If clothing was armor and fire was survival, then food was firewood for the body. The mountain men did not eat for pleasure. They did not eat to enjoy flavors, textures, or variety. They ate because the body needed fuel to burn, and without that fuel, the cold would move in. Not instantly, not dramatically, just steadily, quietly, the way winter always works. Patient, unhurried, absolute. There is a simplicity to eating in the wilderness that strips away every layer of indulgence modern life has added. Today, food is wrapped in ceremony. We choose what we are in the mood for, how quickly we want it, how it aligns with our health goals, or our culture, or our schedule. But in the mountains, there was only one question. Will this keep me warm enough to stay alive through tomorrow? That was the entire menu. The mountain men understood something we tend to forget, that food is energy, not metaphorical energy, not the kind of energy you feel after a good breakfast. Actual, physical, mechanical energy, heat produced inside your body that prevents your bloodstream from freezing and your organs from slowing down. In the wilderness, calories were not numbers. They were hours of life. Fat was everything. If meat had fat on it, it was worth far more than meat that was lean. A piece of fatty beaver tail was prized. A thick elk tongue was considered a delicacy. Anything with grease was saved, stored, rationed, and respected. Even the drippings collected in the bottom of a pot were eaten or poured into broth to stretch warmth a little further. Lean meat, no matter how plentiful, could not sustain a man long. It burned too fast. It warmed the body briefly and then left it hollow again. The mountain men called this rabbit starvation a slow weakening of the body while still eating full meals of meat. Without fat, the body consumed itself. And the mountains taught that lesson quickly. So the men hunted differently than we imagine. They did not chase the biggest animal because it was the biggest. They chased the animals that offered the most warmth, the most stored fire, the most endurance. In good times, they roasted meat over flame. In leaner times, they boiled bones to pull every particle of fat and minerals into a thin, smoky broth. Nothing was wasted, not hide, not marrow, not tendon. This was not resourcefulness. It was respect. When you rely directly on the landscape for food, you cannot afford waste. Waste is disrespect. Disrespect is expensive. The mountain always collects its due. Jerky was more than a travel snack. It was insurance. Hard, salty, nearly unbreakable, jerky carried the essence of survival. Food that does not rot. Food that follows you. Food that waits. A single strip could mean the difference between continuing up the ridge or stopping, and stopping was a dangerous word in the mountains. But eating was not just about hunting. There were long periods when prey moved elsewhere, rivers froze, or snowstorms erased the world for days at a time. In those stretches, creativity and judgment mattered as much as skill. The mountain men ate what the land offered, which sometimes meant things no one would willingly choose. They boiled roots dug from frozen ground. They scraped lichen from rocks and simmered it into thick, bitter paste. They roasted the inner bark of trees. They brewed pine needle tea for strength and clarity. They chewed on rawhide and leather when hunger stretched thin enough to echo. A belt or boot could be softened, shaved, boiled, and swallowed. And while this was never plan A or plan B or C, it kept life going until the next opportunity appeared. We could call this grim. We could call it desperate. But the mountain men did not see it that way. They did not assign emotion to necessity. Hunger was not moral. It was not personal. It simply existed. The mountain did not provide lessons wrapped in meaning. It provided material. What you did with those materials was up to you. Fire, again, played its part. Cooking made food easier to digest. But cooking required wood. Wood required gathering. Gathering required hands that could still move and legs that could still walk. If you were too hungry to collect wood, you could not cook. If you could not cook, you stayed hungry. Everything in winter was a circle, and every circle required motion. Eating in the mountains taught men moderation without ever mentioning it. You never ate until full. You ate until the body stopped shaking. You ate until your hands stopped trembling. You ate until the world stopped feeling too bright and too sharp. Fullness was indulgence. Warmth was the goal. Meals were not social gathering. Conversation was unnecessary. A man chewed quietly because chewing kept the jaw warm. Breath stayed close to the chest to conserve heat. The fire crackled. The stew simmered. The silence did the rest. And yet, despite the harshness, there was something profoundly grounding about this way of eating. It made a person aware of the connection between body and world. Every bite carried memory. The river where the animal drank, the valley where it fed, the trail that led to it. Eating was acknowledgement of the effort it took, of the life exchanged, of the warmth gained. In a strange way, we have lost this clarity. Food today is abundance without awareness, choice without understanding, flavor without necessity. We have separated ourselves from the source of our own survival. The mountain men could not afford that separation. To eat was to remember why one was alive. Thus to hunger was to remember the mountain was bigger. And to cook was to thank the small circle of fire keeping the cold outside the boundary of light. They did not eat to celebrate the day. They ate to continue it. Because tomorrow the cold would be waiting again, and the body would need more fire to meet it. What the mountain men understood is simple. Food is not just nourishment. Food is endurance. Food is a quiet promise made to the future self. It says, I will carry you a little farther. Keep going. For most of us, now, night is a boundary that feels soft. It is when lights turn warm, blankets are pulled up, doors are locked, and the world becomes smaller, quieter, safer. But for the mountain men, night did the opposite. When the sun dropped behind the ridges, the world did not calm down, it expanded. The cold deepened, the darkness thickened, and every sound that had seemed distant during the day came closer. Night was not a time to rest. It was a time to negotiate. The fire became the center of everything. As long as it burned, the cold remained outside the small circle of flickering orange light. But fire shrinks at night. Flames settle into coals. Wood burns faster than you think. And even the most determined man must eventually sleep. So sleep became something like a truce. You never slept deeply. Deep sleep belonged to another kind of life. In the mountains, you slept like a door left slightly open, never fully shut, never fully relaxed. Your ears remained awake. The crackle of the fire, the soft moan of wind in the trees, the distant shuffle of an animal in the snow. These were not background noise. They were signals. They meant things were still as they should be. But if the fire changed its voice, if the crackle faded suddenly, if smoke shifted direction, if sparks rose harder than before, instinct jolted the body upright. There was no grogginess, no confusion. The cold trained the body to wake instantly, because waking too slowly had consequences. The first sensation after waking was always the same, the air on the face. If it bit sharply, the fire was dying. If it froze inside the nose, the fire was nearly gone. If the breath began to feel slow and heavy in the chest, the cold had already taken several steps inward. So a man rose no matter how exhausted and fed the fire. Sometimes in the middle of the night, when the cold pressed hardest, the world was reduced to one task: break wood, place wood, breathe, sit, wait for warmth to return. These moments felt outside of time. No past, no future, just flame, snow, and breath. It was during these nights that a person truly understood their own limits, not the limits of strength or endurance, but the limits of fear. The cold did not shout. It whispered. It said, "You are small, you are finite, but you are still here." And sometimes the night answered back with silence. Sleep itself was not restful. It was a kind of drifting, the body curled tightly, instinctively guarding the core. Blankets were animal skins, stiff with frost on the outside, warm only where the body had heated them slowly. The ground beneath was always cold, even if layered with pine boughs or firs. Heat rises, cold waits below. The earth itself seemed to hold winter. In the darkness, dreams were strange, slow, heavy, sometimes frighteningly vivid. The mind tried to process hunger, exhaustion, and silence. The mountains did not leave the men during sleep. They followed them inward. And yet, sleep, such as it was essential. Without it, the hands shook. The mind wandered. Judgment frayed. And judgment was survival. A single misjudgment in winter could unravel everything. A misplaced step. A forgotten ember. A glove removed for just a moment too long. So the mountain men taught themselves micro-sleep long before the term existed. Dozing in short stretches, waking at the slightest shift of temperature, their bodies became attuned to the fire's rhythm. When the flame dimmed, the body rose. When it brightened, the body settled again. The fire became less of a tool and more of a heartbeat. Nights were also when the mind grew loud. During the day, movement kept thoughts away. But at night, sitting beside the fire with the wind pushing against the edges of the world, memories surfaced. Faces from home, voices from towns far away. Regrets moved like shadows. Some men talked to the fire, not in madness, but in companionship. A whisper into the flames did not echo. It simply disappeared into warmth. A confession, a thought, a memory released. Others sat in silence, letting the crackle answer for them. There were nights when loneliness felt like another cold, less fatal, but just as sharp. And in those moments, the fire was not just warmth, it was present. Proof that the world had not swallowed you yet. Storm nights were different. Storm nights were trials. Wind howled across the peaks like something ancient. Snow did not fall gently, it tore sideways. The fire had to be shielded with the body. The lean-to trembled. The cold seeped in through every gap. The night became a test of patience, resolve, and stillness. There was no sleeping during storm nights. You waited. You breathed. You endured. And if dawn came, if the snow had not buried the world too deeply, if the fire had not been smothered, if the body had not lost too much heat, then the sun rose like a quiet victory, not triumphant. Just enough. A thin light in a pale sky. A reminder that life had continued. Nights in the mountains did not romanticize struggle. They did not reward bravery. They did not soften for fear. But they taught a lesson that is easy to forget in a world full of warmth and noise. Rest is not something given. Rest is something earned. And sometimes, survival is the rest. When dawn finally came, the cold did not disappear. The mountains did not become friendlier, but the fire was still burning. The body was still breathing, and that was enough. A new day began. A new negotiation would follow. And the quiet endurance of the mountain men continued one night, one flame, one breath at a time. By the time a mountain man had survived more than one winter, his body no longer resembled the one he brought into the wilderness. The mountains reshaped him, not through sudden hardship, but through long, steady pressure, day after day, cold after cold, hour after hour. The change was gradual, but unmistakable. At first, winter in the mountains was assault. Hands cracked, lips split, fingertips throbbed with heat and then with sharp stinging pain. Joints stiffened, ears burned, toes tingled. The body protested every moment spent outdoors, but the cold does not negotiate, and the body does not get to refuse. So it learned. The hands, especially, transformed, they thickened. The skin grew coarser, rougher, as if it had begun to armor itself. The fingertips no longer felt surfaces in delicate detail. They felt pressure, not texture. Fine sensitivity was the first thing the cold claimed. But strength remained. Grip remained. The body protected what mattered most to survival. Frostbite was not unusual. It was not dramatic, the way stories sometimes describe it. It was not sudden. It was slow, quiet, creeping. It arrived like dusk, gradually. Then all at once, a man would remove a glove for a task that required precision, thinking he would only need a moment. But cold does not measure time the way clocks do. A few seconds in deep winter can change a hand. The pain came first, sharp, electric, immediate. Then the pain softened, then it vanished. And it was when the pain vanished that a man understood the real danger. Pain was proof of life. Numbness was warning. The mountain men learned to fear numbness more than pain. Pain meant the blood was still struggling, still moving, still burning fuel. Numbness meant the cold had already begun to win. They learned to watch their own bodies the way they watched weather. A stiff finger, a pale patch of skin, a toe that stopped answering command. And when they saw these signs, they acted quickly, decisively, without hesitation. Hands were pressed beneath armpits. Feet were rubbed. Fire was sought immediately. There was no pride in enduring numbness. Pride was useless in the mountains. Survival was the only measure of success. The body also changed internally. A diet of fat, dried meat, and broth shifted metabolism. It turned the body into a furnace. The mountain men burned calories the way their campfires burned wood, constantly, hungrily, with no reserve. Their bodies became engines designed to convert food into heat and heat into motion. Even the cold became part of their breathing. They learned to inhale slowly, to warm air before it entered the lung. A rush of frozen air could cause coughing that wasted heat and energy, so breath became rhythm, controlled, steady, measured. The cold taught discipline. Feet, too, became different. Always damp, always pressed into stiff boots, always on the move, they thickened and toughened. Toes flattened, nails cracked. But feet kept walking. They had to. And a day's march in winter was not measured in distance, it was measured in how much warmth the body could maintain. If you walked too fast, you sweated. Sweat froze. If you walked too slow, your blood cooled. So the pace of movement became a matter of survival, a rhythm discovered through experience, repeated through necessity. The body adapted to that rhythm, and eventually the cold became background, not comfortable, never comfortable, but familiar. Just another sensation. Like hunger, like thirst, like time. Pain also changed, meaning in the mountains. Pain was not an emergency. It was feedback. The body's messages were simple and direct. Pain in your fingers meant move your hands closer to the fire. Pain in your legs meant keep walking. Blood must circulate. Pain in your cheek meant turn away from the wind. Protect your skin. Pain did not stop you. Pain instructed you. The mountain men did not panic at discomfort. They did not panic at most things. Panic wasted air, wasted heat, wasted thought. Calm was not a virtue. It was efficiency. Because the cold rewarded efficiency, the cold rewarded patience. The cold rewarded awareness. But numbness did not reward anything. Numbness was the cold's quiet conquest. A numb hand could not strike flint. A numb foot could not carry weight. A numb face could freeze without warning. So numbness was treated like an alarm bell ringing inside the bones. When numbness appeared, a man acted immediately, without discussion, without delay. There was no time for hesitation in winter. And yet, for all the hardship, There was something extraordinary in the human body's ability to adapt. The longer a man lived in the mountains, the more his body learned to work with the cold instead of against it. His blood thickened, his breathing slowed, his endurance strengthened. The cold no longer felt hostile, it simply existed. And the man existed within it. This adaptation was not romantic. It was not heroic. It was simply necessary. The mountains did not reward strength for its own sake. They rewarded attention. They rewarded humility. They rewarded those who understood that the world was larger, older, and more patient than they were. The mountain men did not conquer the cold. They made space beside it. They carved out a narrow margin of warmth and life. And they held that margin with steady hands and quiet resolve. Pain was not their enemy. Pain was the hand on the shoulder reminding them to continue. Numbness was the shadow they watched for. Numbness was the silence they feared. The body learned. The body remembered. The body endured. Over time, as the cold reshaped the body, the silence reshaped the mind. The mountain men did not simply live alone, they lived in a kind of aloneness most of us cannot easily imagine. There were no voices in the next room, no footsteps passing on the street outside, no distant hum of living cities. There was the wind. There was the snow. There was the fire. And there was the heart, beating steadily, the only familiar sound in a world that did not speak back. Days might pass without encountering another human being, sometimes weeks. And yet, these men were not entirely without companionship. They built their relationships with the small circle of living things that remained close: their horse, their dog, and the fire itself. The horse was not transportation. The horse was partnership. A horse sensed danger faster than a man ever could. Its ears flicked toward sounds the human ear could not separate from the wind. Its breath steamed in the air like a signal. A horse's calm meant safety. Its fear meant movement immediately. The mountain men trusted their horses with a kind of instinctive loyalty, not affection in the soft sense, but reliance in the deepest sense. They slept close enough to hear the animal breathing. They woke when it shifted its weight. They understood each other without words. The dog was different. A dog was presence, warmth, recognition. The dog reminded the mountain man that he was still a person, not simply a creature surviving inside winter. Dogs listened when men spoke, and men spoke not because the dog could answer, but because saying thoughts aloud gave them shape. A sentence spoken into mountain silence dissolved into the air. A sentence spoken to the dog landed somewhere. The dog did not judge, did not reply, did not interrupt. It simply stayed. And sometimes staying is the deepest form of companionship that exists. The fire, too, was part of this circle. A man could sit beside the fire and feel something close to conversation. Its crackling changed with the wood. Its glow shifted with the wind. It responded when tended. It flickered in ways that suggested mood, though the suggestion came from the mind of the watcher, not from the flame itself. In other words, the fire kept a man from disappearing into silence. But silence was still there, always there. And silence, when stretched long enough, becomes a mirror. The mountain men were not running from society in a dramatic sense. They did not slam doors behind them. They simply drifted away from noise and expectation until they discovered that the vastness of the wilderness suited them better than the closeness of towns. Yet, in that vastness, something else happened. They began to see themselves as they truly were, stripped of all social reflection. There was no one to impress, no one to argue with, no one to prove anything to. Winter did not care about pride, ego, reputation, or story. Winter stripped the man down to survival. And in survival, the self becomes very clear. If a man was patient, he saw patience reflected back at him. If he was restless, restlessness echoed in the wind. If he carried old grief, it traveled with him, step by step, through the snow. The mountains did not heal these things. They simply made it impossible to ignore them. Some men found peace in that. Some men found madness. Most found something in between. The mind learned to quiet because speaking wasted heat. The heart learned to slow because panic wasted oxygen. The emotions learned to soften because outbursts had no audience. And slowly, solitude became a kind of language. A mountain man knew how to sit without fidgeting, how to think without spiraling, how to feel without being overwhelmed. This was not absence of emotion. It was the refining of it. When a person spends enough time in solitude, the difference between loneliness and aloneness becomes clear. Loneliness is hunger. Aloneness is present. Loneliness says, I am missing something. Aloneness says, I am here. Many mountain men discovered, over the long winters, that they needed less from the world than they once believed. Conversation became precious. A shared fire became sacred. Meeting another traveler could feel like meeting a brother, not because they shared history, but because they shared understanding. The understanding of cold, silence, hunger, endurance, the quiet companionship of survival. And when they returned to towns in spring, the noise of civilization felt overwhelming. People spoke quickly. They moved quickly. They argued over things that felt small. The mountain men did not look down on these things. They simply no longer recognized them as necessary. They found themselves listening differently, thinking differently, breathing differently. The wilderness had rewired them. And yet, solitude was never absolute. The horse, the dog, the fire. These formed a small, warm constellation in the vast winter night. A living reminder that connection does not require crowds. It only requires presence. The world today fears being alone. Noise fills every corner. Movement fills every pause. But the mountain men learned that solitude is not silence, it is clarity. It teaches what matters. It teaches what endures. It teaches who you are when nothing else is speaking for you. And that may be the deepest lesson the mountains offered. In solitude, a person does not become smaller. They become unmistakably themselves. When we look back at the lives of the mountain men, it is tempting to frame them as relics, rough figures carved into history, interesting but distant. But the truth is more uncomfortable. The mountain men were not simply people from another time. They were people shaped by conditions humans are still built to endure, but rarely choose to face anymore. The world they lived in demanded capability before comfort. Everything they did, from waking in the morning to keeping their fire alive, was effort. There was no autopilot, no conveniences to lean on. Every meal, every degree of warmth, every passing day was something they earned. And because of that, they understood something most modern people have forgotten. Comfort is not the default state of life. Cold is, hardship is. The world is not naturally arranged to protect us. It is indifferent. The mountain men did not resent that indifference. They treated it as truth. To them, the cold was not an enemy. The cold was simply the baseline. Warmth was the exception. Warmth was a gift. Warmth was a miracle you built with your hands and guarded with your life. Today, we expect the cold to be something we can escape from with a thermostat. We think discomfort is a problem that exists to be solved. They understood discomfort as a signal, information, feedback, instruction. Cold did not say suffer. Cold said prepare. Cold said pay attention. Cold said earn your place here. When you live in an environment like that long enough, your relationship to difficulty changes. You stop asking, why is this hard? And instead you ask, how do I rise to meet it? That is something our era speaks about constantly, but rarely practices. We talk about resilience, about strength, about discipline. But most of our struggles are internal or emotional, not physical. They are rooted in stress rather than survival. And comfort. Constant comfort makes stress feel larger than it is. The mountain men lived in a world where there was no confusion about what mattered. Before they worried about morality, reputation, ambition, or meaning, they had to worry about whether they had enough wood for the night, whether the storm was moving in, whether the animal they hunted would be there tomorrow, whether their fingers would still work when morning came. Life was simplified by necessity. Not easier, never easier, but simpler. Cold carved away the unimportant. Warmth restored what was essential. Silence made thought honest. Solitude made emotions clear. But history does not stand still. By the mid-1800s, the world that shaped these men began to disappear. The railroads crept westward. Towns grew where wilderness once stretched unbroken. The fur trade collapsed as fashion changed. People who once hunted beavers deep in the mountains now found that their skills were no longer needed, not by industry, not by society, not even by the land itself, which was being divided, fenced, tamed. Comfort began to move into places where only hardship had existed. And the mountain men, those who survived long enough to witness the change, saw something strange happen. People began to believe the cold could be defeated. They brought stoves. They built cabins. They mapped trails. They placed stations and outposts and heaters and blankets along the way. They turned the mountains into a place that could be visited, not survived. And in doing so, something subtle disappeared. Not the wilderness, though, that too shrank, but the humility required to live in it. When difficulty becomes optional, the lessons it teaches fade. When comfort is always available, the muscles that hold resilience begin to soften. The mountain men were not stronger because they were born different. They became stronger because the world they lived in demanded it. Their strength was shaped by circumstance, not identity. A man sitting in a warm house today is not weaker by nature than a man who slept in snow 2 centuries ago. But he lives in a world where he never has to meet the colder parts of himself. He never has to learn the quiet, patient strength that awakens when you have no choice but to keep going. The mountain men did not seek glory. They did not seek moral lessons. They did not seek transformation. The cold taught them anyway. It taught them that panic wastes energy. That fear can be managed. That patience is survival. That small effort, repeated steadily, keeps you alive. That silence is not emptiness, it is clarity. It taught them that capability is not something you have. It is something you do. Every day. Again and again. Until weakness has nowhere left to hold on. When their era passed, the world gained safety but lost something else. We lost the understanding that life is something we meet with effort. That heat must be tended. That clarity must be earned. That strength must be built, not imagined. And somewhere in that loss, a quiet truth slipped out of view. Warmth is temporary. Cold is the default. Not just in weather, but in life. Comfort fades. Challenges arrive. Seasons change. Certainty melts. Meaning comes and goes. But the part of us capable of surviving that cold, both literal and emotional, remains. Waiting. Untested. Not gone. Only quiet. The mountain men learned to listen to that part of themselves. It is the part humanity still carries. We do not need to return to the wilderness to remember it. But we do need to remember that capability is something we maintain, not something we inherit. And comfort is not the measure of a good life. Meaning is. And meaning, more often than not, is found where things are difficult. Where you must stay aware. Where you must stay present. Where you must stay awake. Just like a fire in winter. If we shift our gaze from the frozen silence of the mountains to another world entirely, we step into a medieval kitchen, one filled not with snow, but with smoke. And, just like the cold shaped the mountain men, fire shaped medieval life. Fire was the first tool, the first teacher, and the center of every home. Not a polite blue flame behind a glass panel, but a roaring, unpredictable force that demanded respect. The moment you entered a medieval kitchen, your senses were overwhelmed. The air carried the smell of wood smoke, simmering broth, and baked bread. A large open hearth dominated the room, a kind of living heart that pulsed heat into every corner. Beside it, iron cauldrons hung from chains, pots bubbled slowly, and spits turned over coals that glowed like embers from another world. This fire was not just for cooking. It provided warmth during winter. It dried clothes. It heated water. It lit the room at night. It was the axis around which daily survival revolved. If the fire died, life slowed. If the fire flourished, life continued. But just like the cold teaches humility, fire teaches attention. You could not leave a hearth unattended. Sparks jumped. Logs collapsed. Flames grew unpredictable. Cooking was not just a task, it was a negotiation. A conversation with heat. Too much flame, and the meal scorched. Too little, and nothing cooked at all. The differences in how people interacted with that fire reflected their position in medieval society. Food, more than almost anything else, revealed status. What was cooked, how it was cooked, and how it was served, all of it communicated who you were. For peasants, farm laborers, shepherds, villagers, the kitchen was small and practical. Meals were simple because life was simple. A pot hung over the fire contained pottage, a thick vegetable stew made from barley, oats, beans, and whatever the garden or field could offer. It simmered all day, absorbing flavors slowly. It was not glamour. It was not meant to be. It was survival in edible form. Bread, dense and dark, stretched every meal. Meat was rare, appearing mostly during festivals or harvest celebrations. The fire in a peasant home was quiet, steady, predictable, kept alive more for warmth than for feasting. But in noble kitchens, inside castles and manor houses, the story changed entirely. Here, cooking became performance. The fires were larger. The kitchens were staffed with entire teams of cooks, apprentices, bakers, spit turners, herb gatherers, and cleaners. Meals served to nobles were not simply meals, they were statements. All to host a feast was to display power, wealth, reach, influence. A noble table was often covered with dishes meant to impress rather than simply nourish. A roast boar, a pie filled with game birds, fish cooked in wine, bread as white as snow, reserved for those who could afford finely sifted flour. And then there were spices, rare, costly, and deeply symbolic. Cinnamon brought from distant traders, pepper carried across deserts and seas, saffron, more expensive than precious metal, by weight. A sprinkle of spice meant connection to global trade network. It meant you had influence, or at least enough coin to pretend you did. Even sugar was treated as a spice used sparingly, treasured for its sweetness and its status. To eat with spices was to participate in the world beyond your own horizon. And yet, despite these differences, both peasants and nobles shared something fundamental: reliance on the fire. Whether a humble pottage or a grand feast, heat made food possible. Heat made survival possible. But fire was also unpredictable, and medieval cooks had no timers, no thermometers, no precise measurement. Recipes were passed down through memory, practice, and instinct. A good cook was someone who could read heat the way a sailor reads wind. They listened to the crackle of wood. They watched the color of the embers. They smelled the air. They adjusted the flame without ever needing numbers. Cooking was intuition in motion. In that environment, kitchen tools were far from delicate. Iron pots were heavy enough to require strength to lift. Knives doubled as personal eating utensils. Cauldrons were treasures passed between generations. Wooden spoons were smoothed by years of use. Even bread ovens were shared among entire communities, villagers marking their loaves with symbols so they could claim them later. And of course, there was preservation. Without refrigeration, medieval people depended on drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting. Salt was not seasoning, it was security. A house with salt had time. A house without salt had urgency. Smoked fish could last through winter. Dried apples could travel distances. Pickled vegetables could resist decay. Food was not just nourishment. It was planning. It was survival across seasons. But perhaps the most interesting thing about the medieval kitchen is that it was not just a place of work. It was a place of memory, community, and storytelling. Families gathered around the fire. Conversations unfolded there. Songs were sung. Stories repeated. Daily life curled itself around the warmth, just as snow curled against the windows outside. The fire was not only the center of the kitchen, it was the center of time itself. And just like the cold shaped the mountain men, fire shaped the medieval household. One taught resilience through endurance. The other taught resilience through patience. Where cold carved away distraction, fire demanded attention. Where cold silenced the mind, fire stirred it. Together, they reflect something simple and enduring. Survival is not only physical, it is emotional. It is cultural. It is collective. We learn who we are by how we respond to the world that sustains us. And whether in a frozen mountain clearing or a warm medieval kitchen, the lesson remains the same. Life must be tended, like a fire, like a meal, like a season, like a story. And when we step into the small French town of Loudun in the early 17th century, we step into a world where faith and fear existed so closely together that they were nearly indistinguishable. This was a time when the church shaped not only how people prayed, but how they understood illness, emotion, desire, and even imagination. In such a world, the line between spiritual experience and psychological strain was extremely thin, and when social tension, personal resentment, and political ambition entered the picture, that line could disappear entirely. At the center of Loudun, there was a convent of Ursuline nuns, young women whose days were disciplined by silence, prayer, contemplation, and strict routines. Their world was enclosed, structured, and deeply shaped by expectations of purity. But their inner life, the human part of them, was not so easily controlled. These women lived with loneliness, longing, pressure, and the quiet intensities of enclosed thought. Into this environment came the name of a priest, Urbain Grandier. He was educated, articulate, and confident. He spoke with charisma that made people listen, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with irritation. For a town accustomed to hierarchy, humility, and obedience, Grandier's presence was provocative. He defended independence where others demanded conformity. He spoke boldly where others whispered. And he carried himself in a way that suggested he understood the power of his own influence. Rumors grew around him. Some called him gifted. Some called him arrogant. Some called him dangerous. And some simply could not ignore the fact that he had a kind of presence that lingered in memory, especially among those seeking spiritual guidance. When the Ursuline nuns began reporting sleepless nights, visions, or strange emotional unrest, Grandier's name soon surfaced not because of what he had done in reality, but because he was the most compelling figure for the mind to attach meaning to. One nun in particular began describing dreams in which he appeared. Her descriptions were vivid, emotional, filled with longing and fear at the same time, in a setting where the language of emotion was interpreted through the language of spiritual struggle. These experiences did not remain private. Feelings became confession. Confessions became rumors. Rumors became declarations. Declarations became proof. Soon, other nuns began to experience similar turmoil. Their behavior shifted. They cried out during prayer, fainted during services, and described sensations of being tormented by invisible forces. Their inner distress found outward expression, and once others witnessed it, the pattern spread. Not because anyone was acting with deception, but because human emotion is contagious, especially when given a religious frame. At this moment, the town might have calmed the situation with patience, care, and understanding. But the world beyond Loudun was already tense. The Catholic Church was defending its authority during a period of political pressure and religious division. Cardinal Richelieu, one of the most powerful figures in France, was reshaping the country's political landscape. And Grandier, who had publicly criticized certain policies, was already viewed as a thorn in the side of authority. So when the nuns named him as the source of their torment, the accusation did not exist in a vacuum. It aligned with existing suspicion. It confirmed what certain people already wanted to believe. The church sent exorcists. The exorcists did not enter the convent quietly. They entered with ceremony, with expectation, with drama. The nuns' reactions grew more dramatic because the environment rewarded expression. Their experiences were witnessed, echoed, confirmed, intensified. What began as emotional distress became theater, because theater was the language that the public understood and the church could use. Crowds gathered. Reports spread. Voice rose. Every cry became proof. Every gesture became spectacle. And Grandier, regardless of his innocence or guilt, was no longer a person. He was now a symbol of temptation. If you believed the nuns, a symbol of defiance if you followed the politic, a symbol of threat. If you supported the church's authority, there was no longer room for nuance. Nuance does not survive in environments of fear. His trial was not a search for truth, it was a performance of certainty. Witnesses did not describe fact, they described stories shaped by expectation. The case against him was built not on evidence, but on emotional logic. If so many people believe it, it must be real. If spiritual distress is present, there must be a cause. If the cause is unclear, the most compelling suspect must be responsible. A belief repeated in public begins to feel like a truth. Grandier maintained his innocence. He spoke calmly. He appealed to reason. He insisted that hysteria was being mistaken for possession. But in a society more comfortable with miracles and demons than psychology, reason had little voice. His trial ended where such trials often ended by reinforcing the power of those already in control. His execution did not quiet the nuns' distress. It did not cure their visions. It did not resolve the emotional tension inside the convent. But it satisfied the public desire for resolution. It provided a narrative ending. It offered closure to those who needed a clear cause for confusion. Even after grandeur was gone, some of the nuns continued to shake, shout, collapse, or slip into altered, breathless states during prayer. The outward symptoms remained even after the supposed cause had been removed. This revealed a truth that the townspeople did not want to acknowledge. The problem had never been grandeur. The problem had been the conditions that shaped the minds and hearts of those living in Loudun. Isolation, pressure, expectation, conflicting desire, fear. But once a narrative is accepted, especially a dramatic one, few wish to undo it. What happened in Loudun was not a unique incident. It was a window into the human mind under stress. When meaning is uncertain, people seek explanation. When emotions overwhelm, people seek language big enough to contain them. In that world, the language of possession was one of the few frameworks available. And once a story gains power, it can shape reality. The Loudun affair remains a study in how belief can be influenced by environment, authority, and suggestion. It reminds us that humans do not experience the world directly. We experience it through interpretation. And when fear and belief align, interpretation becomes destiny. To understand medieval Paris, we must understand that it lived with two identities at once. By daylight, it was a city of churches, scholars, merchants, and devotion. Cathedrals rose like stone, prayers above the rooftops. Bells marked the hours of worship. Monks copied manuscripts. Priests preached virtue. From the outside, it appeared to be a city structured around spiritual discipline and moral clarity. But after sunset, the rhythms of the city shifted. The same streets that echoed with hymns by day carried whispers of loneliness, longing, exhaustion, and the need to forget one's burdens by night. Paris was not only a center of faith, it was also a place of hunger for connection, warmth, and companionship in many forms. And where there is hunger, there will always be places built to meet it. The brothels of medieval Paris existed in this shadowed space, neither fully hidden nor fully acknowledged. They were not celebrated, but they were not erased either. They were woven into the life of the city in a way that makes it clear society was not simply divided between purity and sin. It was shaped by the negotiation between the two. The women who worked in these establishments were not figures of mystery or decadence. They were individuals shaped by circumstance. Many came to Paris because they had nowhere else to go. Some fled famine in the countryside. Some had been orphaned or widowed. Others found themselves without family, training, or legal protection. In a world where survival depended heavily on one's social position, these women stepped into a trade that was not about desire as much as endurance. The brothels provided something the city rarely offered to women without status, shelter, food, and the chance to earn coin. In some cases, they offered not only survival, but a form of community. There were hierarchies inside these establishments. Older women, having learned the complexities of dealing with clients, city officials, and the instability of the streets, became managers. They negotiated terms, ensured safety when possible, and maintained connections with guards or merchants to keep the business running. These older figures were often sharper, more strategic, and more socially perceptive than many of the men who visited. Their work required reading intentions, moods, tone of voice, and risk skills that did not appear in guild apprenticeships but were learned through experience. Their economic reality also reveals something critical about medieval society. The formal economy depended on the informal one. Taxes collected from brothels funded city functions. Rent payments went to landlords who might be clergy or merchants. Clothing and supplies were purchased from nearby shops. Some institutions of the church owned properties indirectly connected to the trade, though officially they condemned it. The official language was moral censure. The practical reality was cooperation. This tension between public virtue and private reliance is what makes the brothel system a revealing mirror of the time. Medieval Paris did not deny human desire. It merely tried to organize it. The laws attempted to limit where brothels could operate, which clothing their workers could wear, and who could visit. But these restrictions rarely aimed to eliminate the trade. They aimed to keep it predictable. Brothels were often located near certain districts, close to the river where travelers arrived, near the university where scholars lived in cramped quarters far from home, or close to markets where laborers ended their long days. These areas became ecosystems of necessity. Taverns, bathhouses, inn-rooms, and music halls formed an environment where the boundary between social interaction and emotional escape blurred. The clientele reflected all levels of society. Merchants with surplus income sought distraction. Soldiers between campaigns sought relief from the physical and mental strain of conflict. Students sought connection in a city where their intellectual lives were intense but their personal lives uncertain. Even members of the clergy, bound by vows of restraint, were known to walk these same paths. Their visits did not reflect hypocrisy so much as the complexity of being human. But while the brothels were integrated into daily life, the women working inside them carried a burden that others did not. Their presence was accepted when convenient and judged when not. They were needed, but not respected. They were central to the social structure, but excluded from its honor. Their labor supported emotional stability for others, while their own emotional needs were rarely acknowledged. Despite this, their lives were not defined only by hardship. Within these communities, there were friendships, humor, rituals, and resilience. Women supported one another during illness. They shared news of the city. They formed quiet alliances. Some saved money, eventually leaving the trade to run inns, bakeries, or small stalls in the market. Their stories remind us that even in constrained circumstances, agency can shape a life in ways that are subtle but real. The city authorities knew this system could not simply be abolished. When attempts were made to shut down brothels entirely, the trade moved into alleys, boats, or private rooms, making it more dangerous and far harder to monitor. So the city returned again and again to a system of managed tolerance, regulate, tax, limit, inspect, restrict, not to eliminate, but to contain. There was a kind of public performance around morality. Preachers denounced vice from the pulpit. Official proclamations declared devotion to purity. Festivals and feast days brought temporary closures to demonstrate spiritual commitment. But when the celebrations ended, the doors quietly opened again. The city continued. Life continued. The contradiction continued. This contradiction reveals something essential about medieval Paris. The city understood that human beings are complex. They can be devout and flawed. They can seek meaning and escape at the same time. They can hold virtue and longing in the same breath. And rather than deny this, the city created parallel spaces where those different parts of life could exist. The brothels did not simply offer physical relief. They absorbed exhaustion, loneliness, and the emotional weight of a society that demanded discipline during the day, in a world structured around hierarchy, submission, and obedience. These places created temporary spaces where identity could be set aside. Names did not matter. Titles did not matter. The expectations of rank, duty, and doctrine could be suspended, if only briefly. In that sense, the brothels reflected something broader about human life, that people seek connection, not because they are weak, but because they are human. And when we look back on these establishments now, centuries later, what we see is not scandal. What we see is a network of quiet survival strategies, an economy beneath the official economy, a society beneath the official society, a layer of life that existed not to defy virtue, but to fill the spaces where virtue alone could not sustain a person. Medieval Paris was not divided between purity and corruption. It was shaped by the interplay between them, and if we listen closely to its history, we hear a message that feels timeless. People will always seek comfort. People will always seek connection. People will always seek ways to endure their circumstances. No city, no doctrine, no declaration can change that. It can only influence where those needs are allowed to surface. And in the end, the brothels of medieval Paris remind us that history is not built from ideals, it is built from the complex, enduring, resilient nature of the human. So when we look across these stories, from the mountain men enduring the cold, to the medieval kitchen built around a single flame, to the convent in Laudun, where belief blurred into fear, to the hidden districts of Paris, where survival-shaped choices, we see a pattern that stretches through time. People adapt. They adapt to weather. They adapt to hunger. They adapt to loneliness, pressure, faith, and expectation. Every era has its challenges, but the human response is always shaped by the same quiet truth. We learn to endure what life gives us. Strength is not something extraordinary. It is something ordinary, repeated, familiar, something practiced one day at a time. The cold teaches resilience. The fire teaches patience. Belief teaches caution. Need teaches resourcefulness. History is not only about how people lived, it is about what they learned from living. And those lessons do not disappear. They wait. They wait in the quiet moments of our own lives, reminding us that we too are capable of more than we realize. If we listen, if we notice, if we remember. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If you enjoyed this journey, feel free to subscribe, leave a comment, or share where you are watching from. And until next time, stay warm, stay aware, and take care of your fire.